Lake Mead is falling into a dangerous range. America's largest reservoir now holds about 7.573 million acre-feet of water, only 29% full lower than the simple phrase "one-third capacity" even suggests. That number is already severe enough to turn the white mineral bathtub ring on the canyon walls into something like a public warning label. But now another signal is appearing on the water itself. Bright green, harmful algal blooms, cyanobacteria that can make the water unsafe for swimming, unsafe for contact, and especially dangerous for children and pets. The National Park Service warns visitors to avoid water with visible algae because blooms can contain toxins and can move, disappear, or return with the wind. But that is not the scariest part. The most disturbing warning is not only that Lake Mead has less water, it is that the water left behind is beginning to behave differently. Less volume, more heat, slower coves, more exposed shoreline, more pressure on drinking water systems, hydropower, tourism, emergency response, and public trust. This is not just a reservoir losing height, it is a reservoir changing state. So what does toxic algae on a shrinking Lake Mead tell us about the future of water in the American Southwest, and about every system we built assuming the past would repeat itself? Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from, because every place now has its own water limit. Drive down toward Lake Mead, and the first thing you notice is not the water. It is the absence of water. The cliffs remember where the reservoir used to be. They hold the memory in a pale ring wrapped around the rock, a chalk-white band left behind by decades of mineral deposits. It climbs high above the present shoreline, higher than a house, higher than a marina dock, higher than the boats now sitting far below it. The ring is not dramatic because it is mysterious. It is dramatic because it is simple. It is a ruler. It shows, without metaphor, how much of the old lake has vanished. For years, that ring has been the image people associate with Lake Mead's crisis. It has appeared in news reports, documentaries, drone shots, drought stories, climate stories, water policy stories. It has become the visual shorthand for a reservoir in decline. But on the ground, the crisis looks less like a symbol and more like a series of practical interruptions. A road that used to lead easily to a boat ramp now feels longer. A shoreline that used to be familiar has shifted. A cove that used to be deep enough for recreation may now have mud, rocks, submerged hazards, or shallow warm water. Visitors who arrive expecting a lake find a landscape that looks unfinished, as if the desert has started reclaiming the basin piece by piece. And then there is the color. Not the blue of open water under desert sky, not the brown of exposed mud, not the white of the bathtub ring. Green. Bright, suspicious, unnatural-looking green. Streaks or scum near the surface. Floating material along the shoreline. Patches that can appear in sheltered areas and make a family outing suddenly feel like a health decision. The National Park Service tells visitors not to swim, dive, or contact water in areas with algae. It tells them not to drink untreated lake water. It tells them to keep pets and children out of areas with algae. Those instructions sound simple, but they change the emotional meaning of a lake. A lake is supposed to invite contact. It is supposed to pull people toward the water. A harmful algal bloom does the opposite. It turns the shoreline into a boundary. Who is affected by that boundary? Start with the people who live closest to the reservoir. Families in southern Nevada who see Lake Mead not as an abstract asset, but as the great body of water behind their region's survival. Visitors from Las Vegas, Henderson, Boulder City, Kingman, Phoenix, Los Angeles. Boaters who plan weekends around launch ramps, anglers who know the coves, children who do not understand why a green patch of water can be dangerous, dog owners whose pets may run toward the shoreline before anyone can stop them. Then widen the frame. Lake Mead is not only a recreation area, it is a central piece of the Colorado River system, and the Colorado River system is not local. It reaches into farms, cities, tribal lands, hydropower grids, wildlife habitat, interstate agreements, and international commitments with Mexico. A warning sign at one cove is not the same as a regional water emergency. But on Lake Mead, a warning sign is never just a warning sign. It is attached to a reservoir that millions of people depend on indirectly, whether they have ever stood on its shore or not. The official warnings are not written in the language of panic. They are written in the language of public safety. Avoid visible algae. Keep pets away. Do not drink untreated lake water. Report suspected harmful algal blooms because the park cannot monitor every changing patch of shoreline at every moment. The National Park Service says blooms can die off, move around with wind, and disappear, which means the risk is not fixed like a locked gate. It is mobile. It can be present in one place, absent in another, and confusing to anyone who assumes danger should be obvious. That mobility matters. A wildfire has smoke, a flood has current, a heat wave has temperature. Toxic algae has ambiguity. Sometimes it looks like spilled paint, sometimes like pea soup, sometimes like floating mats. Sometimes it may not look dramatic at all to an untrained eye. That is part of the threat. The danger is not only the organism, it is the mismatch between how people use a lake and how a changing lake behaves. A visitor sees water. The system sees chemistry, temperature, sunlight, nutrients, wind, shallow coves, slow circulation, exposure routes, and public compliance. A child sees a place to splash. A park ranger sees a possible bloom. A dog sees a shoreline. A veterinarian may later see the consequences. This is why Lake Mead's algae warning deserves attention beyond the immediate question of whether a particular beach is safe on a particular day. The warning is a small public health message attached to a much larger environmental transition. It shows how drought does not stop at the waterline. It moves into recreation, risk communication, emergency medicine, water treatment, electricity, and the emotional relationship people have with public places. For decades, the story of Lake Mead was told as an engineering story. A dam across Black Canyon, a giant reservoir, a river controlled, stored, released, scheduled, and divided. Hoover Dam became a monument not only to concrete, but to confidence. It represented the belief that the American West could be made predictable if enough concrete, law, and ambition were placed across a river. But now the scene is different. The concrete is still there, the dam still stands, the turbines still matter, the allocation rules still matter, the cities still need water, the farms still need water, the lights still need power, but the basin around the system is hotter, drier, in critical ways, and more stressed. The water stored behind the dam is lower, and in some places, the water near the shore is sending a biological signal that the old engineering picture was incomplete. A reservoir is not only a container, it is water exposed to heat. It is shoreline exposed to air. It is sediment exposed to sun. It is biology responding to changed conditions. It is a public space where risk becomes personal. That is why this story cannot be told only from a helicopter shot. From above, Lake Mead is a shrinking blue shape in a desert basin. From the shoreline, it is a place where a parent decides whether a child should wade. A park employee decides where to post a warning. A marina operator watches access change. A water manager watches elevation. A hydropower operator watches head pressure. A city watches supply. A farmer watches allocation. A scientist watches temperature and bloom conditions. Each person is seeing a different part of the same system. The severity is not only that the lake is low, the severity is that low water changes the context for everything else. When a reservoir is full, it has margin, it has depth, it has thermal mass. It has more distance between shoreline and intake, between a small local bloom and a major operational concern, between recreation and emergency. When the reservoir is drawn down, the margin shrinks. Problems that once sat far apart can move closer together. A shallow cove warms faster. A boat ramp becomes unusable. A shoreline becomes muddy. A bloom warning becomes a visitor safety issue. A low elevation becomes a hydropower issue. A dry year becomes a negotiation crisis. This is why viewers far from Nevada should still care. Because Lake Mead is not an isolated accident, it is a test case. It shows what happens when a system built for one range of climate behavior is pushed into another. It shows that water scarcity is not one problem. It is a problem generator. It creates second-order risks, then third-order risks, and often the second-order risks arrive quietly, disguised as smaller warnings. Do not swim here. Do not let your dog touch this. Do not assume this ramp is open. Do not rely on old maps. Do not expect the lake to behave the way it used to. That is the scene. A massive reservoir below its old shoreline. A public warning about toxic algae. A desert city nearby. a river system stretched across 7 US states and Mexico. And beneath it all, one uncomfortable question. When the water drops, what else drops with it? Confidence, access, safety, predictability. The feeling that the system is still operating inside its design envelope. At Lake Mead, the crisis is visible in the rock, but the more important crisis may be visible in the water that remains. Word count, approximately 1,210. The headline number is simple enough to fit on a screen. Lake Mead, 29% full. That is not a metaphor. It is the Bureau of Reclamation's own hydrologic update. Lake Mead at 1,048.47 feet in elevation, holding 7.573 million acre-feet of water, or 29% of capacity. The same update shows total Colorado River system contents at 20.075 million acre-feet, 34% of capacity. But numbers this large are strangely hard to feel. 7 million acre-feet sounds enormous because it is enormous. An acre-foot is the amount of water needed to cover 1 acre of land, 1 foot deep. Picture a football field-sized area covered in water about ankle to shin deep, then multiply that image until the mind starts to lose track. That is the strange psychology of water storage. Even a crisis still contains a staggering amount of water. The reservoir can be in trouble and still look huge. It can be low and still drown a canyon. It can hold billions of gallons and still be dangerously depleted. That is why percentages matter. A reservoir is not judged only by how much water is in it. It is judged by how much water is in it compared with what it was built to hold, what people expect from it, and what systems depend on it. A car with 1/3 of a tank can still drive, but if that car is crossing a desert, towing a trailer, carrying 40 million people's expectations, and the next gas station is uncertain, 1/3 is no longer reassuring. Lake Mead was designed as a buffer, a savings account, a shock absorber, a way to take the irregular flow of the Colorado River and turn it into something cities, farms, and power systems could plan around. But a reservoir at roughly 1/3 capacity is not acting like a full savings account. It is acting like an account under stress, where every withdrawal matters, every deposit is watched, and every new expense feels larger because the cushion is smaller. This is the difference between a low lake and a stressed reservoir. A low lake is visual. A stressed reservoir is operational. At 29% full, the question is no longer only, how far down is the shoreline? The question becomes, how much margin remains before normal operations begin to bend? How much room is there for another dry year? How much room is there for a weak snowpack? How much room is there for higher evaporation? How much room is there for political delay? How much room is there for water quality issues that require more monitoring, more treatment, more caution, more public communication? That is why the number shocks. Not because 29% means empty, it does not. It shocks because 29% means the system has lost the comfort of abundance. And Lake Mead's number cannot be separated from the larger Colorado River system. The Bureau of Reclamation's update lists total system contents at 34% of capacity. That means the issue is not just one reservoir having a bad moment. It is the storage backbone of an entire river basin operating with reduced reserves. Think of it like a hospital. A hospital can function when many beds are full, but when capacity shrinks and every ward is strained, a smaller emergency can become more serious. A heat wave, an accident, a staffing shortage, none of these has to destroy the hospital by itself. The danger comes from overlap. The danger comes when the system no longer has spare capacity. Lake Mead is spare capacity made visible. When it falls, the southwest's margin falls with it. Now add the algae warning. On its own, a harmful algal bloom advisory might sound like a seasonal recreation issue. Lakes across the country experience blooms. Cyanobacteria are not new. The National Park Service notes that blue-green algae occur on both Lake Mead and Lake Mohave, typically in late summer and early fall, and certain blue-green algae can produce toxins harmful to people and pets. But when that advisory appears in the context of a reservoir at 29% full, it becomes something more. It becomes a reminder that water quantity and water quality are not separate stories. They are connected by physics and biology. Less water can mean different temperatures, different shoreline shapes, different circulation patterns, different exposure zones, different public behavior, different management burdens. The headline number tells you how much water remains. The algae warning asks what kind of water remains. That is the key. A reservoir can be low in volume but still appear calm. It can reflect the sky. It can hold boats. It can support fish. It can still look like a lake, but the internal conditions of that lake may be shifting in ways that are not visible from a distance. The sun does not heat a deep, full, moving system the same way it heats a shallow, slow, protected cove. Wind does not mix every corner equally. Nutrients do not spread evenly. Algae do not bloom evenly. Risk does not arrive evenly. This is why the everyday comparison matters. Imagine a bathtub. Full, it takes time for the water to cool or warm. Drain it down to a few inches, and everything changes quickly. A small amount of soap changes the water. A little dirt becomes more noticeable. The surface warms faster. The bottom is closer. The same container behaves differently because the volume has changed. Lake Mead is not a bathtub. It is vastly more complex, but the principle is useful. Volume creates stability. Lose volume, and the system becomes more sensitive. That sensitivity shows up in ways that do not fit neatly into one headline. It shows up when a marina has to adapt. It shows up when exposed mud traps vehicles. It shows up when visitors are told to avoid bright green water. It shows up when hydropower output becomes more vulnerable to elevation. It shows up when negotiators argue over shortage tiers and releases. It shows up when a river that once seemed large enough to absorb mistakes begins forcing every mistake into the open. The number 29% is not frightening because it means Lake Mead is gone. It is frightening because it means Lake Mead is still here, still essential, still carrying enormous responsibilities, but with far less margin than the system was built to expect. That is the shock. Not emptiness. Dependence without margin. But the most important turn in this story is not the number. It is the condition of the water behind the number. Most drought coverage begins with elevation. How many feet above sea level? How many feet below full pool? How many acre-feet in storage? How close to shortage triggers? Those numbers matter. They are not decorative. They decide water releases. They influence hydropower. They determine policy. They shape interstate tension. They tell managers whether the system is gaining or losing. But elevation is only one way a lake speaks. A lake also speaks through temperature, through color, through smell, through circulation, through the organisms that suddenly find an advantage. That is where the mist story begins. Not just, Lake Mead is losing water, but the water left behind is entering a different operating environment. A full reservoir has depth. It has volume. It has more ability to absorb heat without every shallow edge responding quickly. It has more distance between the surface and the bottom. It has more connected water. It has coves, yes, but those coves exist inside a larger body with more mass. A drawn-down reservoir is not simply the same reservoir with less blue on the map. Its shape changes. Old slopes become new shorelines. Protected arms may become shallower. Edges warm. Mud appears. Rocks appear. Boat traffic shifts. Recreation concentrates in fewer accessible areas. People gather where access remains possible. Biological processes respond to the new geometry. That is why the algae warning matters. It reveals that the lake is not only a storage problem, it is a living water problem. Cyanobacteria are microscopic photosynthetic bacteria, often called blue-green algae because of their color. In freshwater systems, they are among the most common producers of harmful algal blooms, and some cyanohabs can produce toxins that cause illness in people and animals. The EPA warns that harmful cyanobacterial blooms thrive in warm, slow-moving water, and that warming can increase the magnitude and duration of cyanohabs. That sentence changes the frame. Warm. Slow-moving. Those are not exotic conditions. They are exactly the kind of conditions that can become more important when a reservoir is stressed by heat, drought, and low water. This does not mean every green patch at Lake Mead is automatically a climate change event. It does not mean the entire reservoir is toxic. It does not mean tap water is unsafe. Those claims would go beyond the evidence. But it does mean that a shrinking reservoir can create more places where water quality risks deserve attention. The overlooked issue is not algae alone. It is the relationship between quantity and quality. Water managers often separate the two because institutions are built that way. One department tracks storage and releases, another watches public health, another manages recreation, another monitors drinking water, another handles wastewater, another negotiates interstate allocations, another studies climate impacts. The categories make sense on paper, but the lake does not obey the categories. Heat affects biology. Biology affects recreation. Recreation affects public exposure. Public exposure affects emergency messaging. Low water affects access. Access affects where people gather. Where people gather affects risk. And all of it sits inside a river system already operating with reduced storage. This is the hidden mechanism of systemic risk. Problems do not remain in the boxes where agencies first find them. A toxic algae warning may begin as a sign on a shoreline, but it points backward to water temperature, circulation, nutrients, drought, and monitoring capacity. It points forward to public behavior, tourism, pets, emergency rooms, water treatment, and trust. That is why the phrase "one-third capacity" is incomplete. One-third capacity tells you how much of the container is filled. It does not tell you whether the remaining water is cooler or warmer, moving or stagnant, clear or biologically active, easy or difficult to treat, predictable or variable, safe for contact or restricted in certain places. A glass can be one-third full and clean. A glass can be one-third full and contaminated. The percentage alone cannot tell the difference. Lake Mead is far more than a glass, but the same warning applies. A water system is not secure simply because some water remains. It is secure when the remaining water can perform the roles society asks of it. And society asks Lake Mead to perform many roles at once. Store water. Release water. Support hydropower. Receive visitors. Support fish and wildlife. Serve as a symbol of Western engineering. Absorb drought. Absorb political delay. Absorb climate variability. And now, invisible shoreline zones absorb a biological risk that reminds everyone the lake is not just infrastructure, it is an ecosystem under pressure. This is where the story becomes more unsettling, because it suggests that the future of drought will not always look like dry ground. Sometimes it will look like water that is still present, but less trustworthy, water that still sparkles from a distance, but requires warnings up close, water that still fills a reservoir, but no longer behaves like the old reservoir. Not absence. Alteration. Not only scarcity. Instability. That is the real turn. Lake Mead is not only telling us that the southwest may have less water, it is telling us that less water can become different water. And different water changes everything. To understand why toxic algae becomes a warning signal, we have to go beneath the surface. Not very far beneath it. Just far enough to see how heat, stillness, sunlight, nutrients, and microscopic life can turn a calm-looking shoreline into a public health concern. The mechanism at the center of this story can be called a thermal stagnation bloom feedback. The phrase sounds technical, but the idea is simple. Water warms, water slows. The surface becomes more stable. Sunlight feeds photosynthetic organisms. Nutrients help them grow. Some cyanobacteria gain an advantage over other algae. As they grow, they can form visible blooms. Some blooms can produce toxins. The bloom itself may absorb sunlight and warm surface water further, strengthening the conditions that helped it form. A loop begins. Not a magical loop, a physical and biological one. The EPA describes several reasons cyanobacteria can benefit from warmer water. They can grow faster than many other algae at higher temperatures. Some can move up and down through the water column, taking nutrients from cooler, lower layers and using light near the surface. They can also absorb sunlight and release heat, warming surface waters and increasing their competitive advantage. That is the engine. Heat is not just background weather, heat changes competition. In an ordinary mental picture, algae are passive, they just appear when water is dirty. But that picture is too simple. Cyanobacteria are ancient, adaptive organisms. They are microscopic, but they are not weak. They can exploit conditions. They can respond to light. Some can regulate buoyancy. They can form mats, scums, or streaks. They can occupy the surface where sunlight is strongest. Think of a lake as a city. When conditions are cool, mixed, and competitive, no single group may dominate. But when the city becomes hot, still, and structured in a way that favors one group, that group can spread. It takes the best real estate, the sunlit surface. It blocks competitors. It changes the neighborhood. That is what a bloom is, not just growth, but dominance. Now place that mechanism inside Lake Mead. Lake Mead is enormous, so we should be careful. The entire reservoir does not behave like one small pond. Open water, deep channels, coves, marinas, shorelines, inflow areas, and backwaters can all behave differently. A harmful bloom in one area does not mean the whole reservoir has the same risk. But that local variability is exactly why the warning is important. The risky places may be specific. They may appear near shore, they may shift with wind, they may vanish from one location and show up somewhere else. The National Park Service says the park does intermittent monitoring, but blooms can die off, move with the wind, and disappear, so rangers rely on public reporting. That means the public becomes part of the detection system. Not because the public is expert, because the lake is too dynamic for a static warning to capture every change. The mechanism begins with warmth. In desert reservoirs, sunlight is intense. When water levels drop, some nearshore areas can become shallower. Shallow water often warms faster than deeper water because there is less volume to absorb the same heat. Warm water can hold less dissolved oxygen. Warm water can stratify more strongly, meaning layers do not mix as easily. When mixing weakens, the surface can become a more stable platform for cyanobacteria. Then comes stillness. Cyanobacteria do not need the entire lake to stop moving. They need favorable pockets, sheltered coves, edges, places where wind does not fully flush the water, places where circulation is slower, places where floating material can accumulate. A reservoir can have moving water in one part and stagnant risk in another. Then comes light. Cyanobacteria use photosynthesis. Light is energy. Surface position matters. If an organism can remain near the top, it gains access to sunlight. If it can move vertically, it can use both light above and nutrients below. The EPA specifically notes that cyanohabs can migrate in the water column better than other algae, using nutrients from lower layers and light from upper layers. Then comes nutrients. Nutrients do not have to come from one dramatic source. They can come from runoff, sediments, wastewater influences, decaying organic matter, shoreline processes, or watershed inputs. In many water bodies, phosphorus and nitrogen help fuel blooms. Climate extremes can complicate this pattern. Intense rainfall can wash nutrients into water, while drought can keep nutrients concentrated or retained for longer. The EPA warns that climate change affects rainfall patterns, increasing both intense rainfall and drought duration, and that increased runoff can fuel harmful algal blooms. Then comes the toxin question. Not all cyanobacteria produce toxins all the time. That is crucial. A bloom is not automatically toxic in the same way every snake is not venomous. But some cyanobacteria can produce cyanotoxins, including microcystins, which are associated with liver and gastrointestinal illness. The danger is not that every bloom is equally poisonous. The danger is uncertainty. From the shoreline, a visitor may not know what species are present, whether toxins are present, or whether contact is safe. That is why public guidance is conservative. Do not touch visible algae. Do not let children or pets contact it. Do not drink untreated lake water. Do not assume boiling solves the problem. In the case of cyanotoxins, the usual instincts people have around water safety may fail. Clear water is not always safe. Boiling is not always the answer. A dog can be exposed before a person reads the sign. A child can splash before an adult recognizes the color. This is where fear can be replaced by understanding. The bloom is not a monster. It is a process made more likely in certain conditions. And those conditions overlap with the future the Southwest is moving toward. Hotter air, warmer water, stressed reservoirs, altered runoff, longer dry periods, and systems forced to operate with reduced margin. Picture Lake Mead as a giant bowl of water sitting in the desert sun. When the bowl is fuller, it has more depth, more inertia, more ability to absorb shocks. When the bowl drains lower, its edges change. The shallow parts become more important. The sun works faster on the margins. The water's behavior becomes less forgiving. Now imagine that bowl is not just holding water for a picnic. It is holding part of the future of the Southwest. That is the scale mismatch. The biological mechanism may be microscopic, but the system it affects is massive. A cyanobacterium is invisible to the naked eye. A bloom is visible. A warning sign is visible. A closed area is visible. A public health advisory is visible. A tourism impact is visible. A water treatment challenge is visible. A loss of trust is visible. Small organisms can reveal large vulnerabilities. That is why toxic algae is not a side note. It is a diagnostic. A doctor does not ignore a rash because it is smaller than the body. A rash can reveal stress, infection, allergy, immune response, or environmental exposure. The rash is not the whole illness, but it tells you something is happening. A harmful algal bloom on a shrinking reservoir is like that. It does not explain the whole Colorado River crisis. It does not replace drought, overuse, warming, policy, or infrastructure. But it reveals a new surface expression of those pressures. It shows that a reservoir under stress does not only lose water downward, it can change outward at the edges where people meet the system. That meeting point matters. Most people do not encounter water policy in a legal document. They encounter it through price, restriction, access, quality, and safety. They encounter it when a boat ramp closes, when a lawn rebate appears, when a water bill rises, when a beach has a warning, when a pet gets sick, when a reservoir that once seemed permanent begins to look temporary. The mechanism of cyanobacteria turns a regional crisis into something intimate. It says, the climate signal is not only in the snowpack, it may be in the water your child wants to touch. Again, we should be precise. A bloom does not prove that every part of Lake Mead is unsafe. It does not prove direct climate attribution for every bloom. It does not mean the reservoir is lost. But it does show why water security in a warming world cannot be measured only by volume. Water security must include temperature, movement, quality, monitoring, treatment, public communication, ecology, and time. Because one of the most dangerous things about harmful algal blooms is timing. They can arrive when people are using the water most. Warm seasons, recreation seasons, holiday weekends, periods when families seek relief from heat by going to the lake. The same heat that drives people toward water can help create conditions that make some water unsafe. That is not irony. That is systemic risk. The solution is not to panic at every green patch. The solution is to understand the conditions, monitor them, reduce contributing nutrient loads where possible, protect public health, and stop pretending that water quantity and water quality can be managed as separate worlds. Lake Mead's toxic algae warning is not the main event by itself. It is the new warning attached to the old crisis. And it tells us that the old crisis is maturing. The reservoir is not simply going down. The reservoir is changing. There is a reason Toledo matters in this story. It is not because Toledo and Lake Mead are the same. They are not. Toledo sits on Lake Erie, a shallow Great Lake basin with a long history of nutrient pollution and harmful algal blooms. Lake Mead is a desert reservoir on the Colorado River system. Different geography, different hydrology, different water treatment systems, different climate setting, different management history. So the comparison must be careful. But Toledo proves something that people often do not want to believe until it happens. Toxic algae can cross the boundary between an environmental problem and an urban water problem. In 2014, routine testing at the Collins Park Water Treatment Plant in Lucas County, Ohio, found microcystin toxin in drinking water above the state advisory threshold. Microcystin is a liver toxin released by cyanobacteria in certain harmful algal blooms. A do not drink advisory was issued, warning residents not to drink the water, boil it, cook with it, or use it for brushing teeth. The advisory affected more than 400,000 customers and was lifted only after multiple samples showed toxin levels had dropped below the advisory threshold. Pause on that. Not a remote pond. Not a warning at an isolated fishing spot. A municipal water supply. Kitchen sinks. Restaurants. Hospitals. Parents mixing formula. People standing in stores trying to buy bottled water. Public officials trying to communicate a risk that many residents had never imagined. Toledo is important because it collapses the distance between ecology and infrastructure. It shows that a bloom in open water can become a test of treatment plants, emergency messaging, household behavior, and trust. The CDC later found that even though most households heard about the advisory quickly, some still drank or used municipal water during the advisory, and many continued using alternative water sources even after it was lifted. That is what a water crisis does. It continues after the chemical number improves. It leaves doubt behind. People ask, did I drink it? Did my child brush with it? Did the filter work? Did officials know soon enough? Can it happen again? Is the tap still trustworthy? This is why we should not reduce harmful algal blooms to green stuff on water. That phrase makes the issue sound cosmetic, like something unpleasant but minor. In the wrong context, HABs become a governance problem. They force agencies to make decisions under uncertainty. They force residents to interpret warnings. They force treatment systems to manage contaminants that behave differently from ordinary microbes. They force emergency planners to think about bottled water, vulnerable residents, hospitals, schools, and communication channels. Again, Toledo is not a prediction for Lake Mead. This point matters so much it should be said twice. Toledo is not a prediction for Lake Mead. A harmful algal bloom advisory at Lake Mead does not mean Las Vegas tap water is unsafe. It does not mean a Toledo-style do not drink advisory is imminent. It does not mean every reservoir with cyanobacteria will contaminate drinking water. But Toledo is a precedent for the category of risk. It proves that the phrase toxic algae belongs not only in environmental science, but also in water security. It belongs in emergency management. It belongs in infrastructure planning. It belongs in climate adaptation. And it tells us something else. Public confidence is part of the system. Water infrastructure is not only pipes and plants, it is also belief. People turn on the tap because they assume a chain of institutions is working. Monitoring, treatment, regulation, maintenance, communication, emergency response. When that belief is damaged, the cost is not only measured in toxin levels, it is measured in stress, purchases, missed work, health anxiety, and the lingering sense that the invisible system under daily life may not be as invulnerable as it seemed. Lake Mead's warning lives upstream of that kind of fear, not necessarily physically upstream, but conceptually. It is an early-stage reminder that water quality risks can develop in places people rely on for much more than recreation. It asks water managers to think ahead. It asks the public to understand that public health warnings are not overreactions, they are part of the defense system. The old water story was about supply. How much do we have? The new water story is about suitability. What can that water safely do? Can it be touched? Can it be treated? Can it support fish? Can it cool people during extreme heat? Can it move through old infrastructure? Can it generate power? Can it remain reliable through longer droughts and hotter summers? Toledo shows how quickly the suitability question can become urgent. The city's emergency did not begin with dry taps. It began with contamination risk. Water was present, but its use was restricted. That distinction is essential for the future. Water crises do not always look like empty reservoirs. Sometimes they look like water that exists but cannot be used normally. That is a harder crisis for the public to understand because the visual evidence conflicts with the instruction. The lake is there. The tap runs. The water looks normal. And yet the warning says, do not use it this way. That conflict creates confusion. Confusion creates exposure. Exposure creates distrust. Distrust makes the next warning harder. This is why Lake Mead's algae advisory must be understood before it becomes a larger crisis. Not because disaster is certain, but because preparedness depends on noticing weak signals early. The weak signal is this: a water system under climate and demand stress can develop quality risks alongside quantity risks. And once those risks overlap, they can amplify one another. Low water can concentrate attention on fewer access points. Heat can increase recreation demand. Warm, slow areas can support blooms. Blooms require warnings. Warnings affect tourism. Tourism affects local economies. Monitoring requires resources. Treatment systems may need more vigilance. Public communication must be accurate, fast, and trusted. That is not a chain of doom. It is a chain of responsibility. Lake Mead is giving the Southwest a chance to see the chain before it snaps. Toledo gives the country a memory of what happens when invisible toxins enter daily life. For a few days, the modern assumption of safe municipal water broke. People adapted, officials responded, the advisory ended. But the lesson remained. The boundary between natural water and public water is not as thick as people think. It is managed, it is monitored, it is engineered, it is vulnerable. Lake Mead is still managed, still monitored, still engineered, still essential. But it is also warmer, lower, and more exposed to the combined pressures of a changing basin. That is why the comparison matters. Not as prophecy, as warning. The next layer is infrastructure. And infrastructure is where a water crisis stops being scenic. From a distance, Lake Mead's falling level looks like a landscape change. Cliffs, rings, docks, ramps, open desert, but every foot of elevation is connected to something human beings built under assumptions about where the water would be. A boat ramp is an assumption poured in concrete. A marina is an assumption anchored to a shoreline. A water intake is an assumption drilled into a reservoir. A hydropower turbine is an assumption about pressure and flow. A treatment plant is an assumption about source water. A recreation map is an assumption about access. A regional economy is an assumption about reliability. When the reservoir drops, those assumptions are tested. The National Park Service warns that as waters recede in Lake Mead, saturated mud is exposed, and people and vehicles have gotten stuck after going too far without carefully testing the ground. It also notes that water levels change throughout the year, so boaters must approach shore with caution and watch for shallows and submerged debris. That sounds like recreation guidance, and it is. But it is also infrastructure language in disguise. The shoreline is no longer where memory says it should be. The ground is not as stable as it looks. The water is not as deep as expected. Access is not fixed. The map in people's heads may be outdated. Now scale that up. Southern Nevada has spent enormous money preparing for a lower Lake Mead, including deeper intake infrastructure designed to keep water available even as elevations fall. That kind of adaptation is impressive, but it also reveals the problem. You do not build deeper intakes unless the old assumptions are failing. You do not redesign access unless the shoreline is moving beyond the range of ordinary maintenance. You do not treat low water as a permanent planning condition unless the future has already broken part of the past. And Lake Mead is not only a water tank, it is attached to Hoover Dam. Hydropower depends on elevation because water falling through a dam produces energy from pressure or hydraulic head. As reservoir levels decline, the amount of power the same infrastructure can generate can fall. The Bureau of Reclamation has warned that drought conditions create elevated risks to essential water and power infrastructure that supply water to more than 40 million people. This is where the phrase "one-third capacity" becomes too small. Because the real question is not simply how full the lake is. The question is how many systems were designed around a fuller lake. A low reservoir stresses boating first because recreation is visible and immediate. Ramps close, marinas move, visitors complain, local businesses feel the loss. But behind recreation are more essential systems: drinking water delivery, hydropower generation, regional agreements, emergency planning, water quality monitoring. And then behind those are social systems: who pays, who adapts, who waits, who is ignored, who has backup, who does not. Infrastructure failure rarely begins with collapse. It begins with inconvenience, then workarounds, then higher costs, then reduced service, then emergency decisions, then conflict. At Lake Mead, we can see the early stages of that ladder: launch ramps extended or closed, marinas relocated, shorelines altered, visitors warned, water levels watched weekly, federal agencies issuing hydrologic updates with percentages that once would have seemed unthinkable for a reservoir of this symbolic weight. And now, toxic algae adds another kind of burden. It asks the system to monitor not only height but health, not only water quantity but water contact, not only releases but blooms, not only engineering but ecology. That matters because agencies are finite, staff time is finite, budgets are finite, public attention is finite. Every new risk competes with existing risks. At Lake Mead, Officials already manage boating accidents, extreme heat, flash floods, drownings, shifting shorelines, wildfire concerns, protected resources, visitation, and water operations. Harmful algae is not the only danger in the park, but it is one more signal that a changing environment expands the risk portfolio. This is the hidden cost of climate stress. It does not simply make old problems worse, it multiplies categories. A drought plan becomes a water quality plan. A recreation plan becomes a public health plan. A hydropower plan becomes an energy resilience plan. A reservoir plan becomes a social equity plan. Why equity? Because not everyone experiences water stress equally. A wealthy household can buy bottled water, install filters, pay higher bills, drive farther for recreation, absorb utility increases, and relocate from risk if necessary. A low-income household cannot treat adaptation as a lifestyle choice. If water rates rise, electricity rates rise, recreation access shrinks, or public health warnings become more frequent, the burden lands unevenly. Outdoor workers face more heat when water and shade become less accessible. Tribal communities face risks to cultural, ecological, and legal water interests that have often been marginalized. Agricultural workers face the consequences of reduced irrigation before consumers fully understand the chain. Small businesses around recreation areas lose customers when access becomes uncertain. Pet owners face veterinary emergencies. Elderly residents may struggle during water advisories or heat events. People without reliable transportation may have fewer options when public services shift. A reservoir at 29% capacity does not distribute stress evenly. The number is universal. The consequences are not. This is why the algae warning is more than a swimmer's issue. It shows how an environmental change becomes a social filter. The people with the most information, flexibility, and money avoid risk fastest. The people with the least may encounter the risk later, more directly, or with fewer choices. Consider public messaging. Do not contact visible algae, sounds clear, but clarity depends on language, signage, literacy, timing, trust, and behavior. Does every visitor recognize a bloom? Does every family read the website before arriving? Does every dog owner understand how dangerous cyanotoxins can be for pets? Does every tourist know untreated lake water should not be consumed? Does every person believe the warning, or do they treat it as bureaucratic caution? A warning only works if it reaches people before exposure. That is infrastructure too. Communication infrastructure. Trust infrastructure. Public health infrastructure. And in a changing climate, those forms of infrastructure matter as much as concrete. The Southwest has built heroic physical systems: dams, canals, pipelines, pumps, intakes, treatment plants, interstate compacts. But the next era will test whether the social systems are equally strong. Can agencies coordinate across jurisdictions? Can warnings be issued quickly? Can water users reduce demand before crisis? Can cities protect vulnerable households? Can treatment systems adapt to changing source water? Can political agreements adjust before reservoirs reach emergency conditions? Lake Mead's falling level exposes the old infrastructure. The algae warning exposes the newer vulnerability. Together they say, the problem is not one weak link, the problem is a chain under load. And when a chain is under load, even a small new stress matters. Not because it breaks everything alone, because it shows how little slack remains. Now widen the camera. Lake Mead is not simply a lake. It is a measurement device for an entire civilization pattern in the dry American West. For more than a century, the Colorado River has been treated as a river that could be divided, promised, pumped, dammed, stored, litigated, engineered, and expanded around. Its water helped build cities in places where local water alone could never support the same scale of growth. It irrigated farms that feed the country. It powered turbines. It supplied tribal lands, even when many tribal rights were delayed, underdeveloped, or ignored. It crossed borders. It became law, concrete, crops, suburbs, golf courses, air-conditioned life, and national myth. But the river was overestimated. The early allocation of Colorado River water was based on flow records from an unusually wet period. Later, science and experience showed that the long-term river could not reliably provide what had been promised. Then warming added another force. In a hotter basin, snowpack, runoff, soil moisture, evaporation, and plant demand all change. The river does not need rainfall to disappear for stress to deepen. Heat alone can rob the system by increasing atmospheric thirst and reducing the efficiency with which precipitation becomes streamflow. That is why Lake Mead matters. It is where the abstraction becomes visible. The Bureau of Reclamation says Colorado River system storage has fallen to roughly the mid-30% of capacity, and the river supplies water to more than 40 million people while supporting agriculture, hydropower, tribes, wildlife, and recreation. A system that large does not fail in a single dramatic moment. It tightens. It negotiates. It delays. It conserves. It transfers water. It changes releases. It declares shortages. It asks cities to save more. It asks farmers to use less. It watches reservoirs. It updates forecasts. It hopes for snow. It argues about rules. It announces plans. And through it all, the water keeps responding to physics, not politics. That is the deeper pattern. The old baseline assumed that variability would remain inside a familiar range. There would be wet years and dry years. Reservoirs would fall and rise. Snowpack would disappoint and recover. Negotiators would fight, but the system would remain broadly manageable because the climate envelope would remain familiar. The new baseline is different. Not because every year is dry. Not because every lake is doomed. Not because the system has no options. The new baseline is that extremes arrive on top of reduced margin. Heat is higher, demand is large, storage is lower, ecological signals are sharper. Public expectations remain built around reliability, and every new stress is added to a system that has already spent much of its spare capacity. This is why toxic algae is an important warning. It is not replacing the drought story. It is expanding it. A low reservoir tells you the water budget is stressed. A harmful algal bloom warning tells you the water environment is stressed. Together they show that the future is not just about getting enough water into the system. It is about keeping the water usable, safe, affordable, treatable, and publicly trusted under hotter conditions. That is a harder challenge. A city can reduce lawn watering and save water. A farmer can change irrigation methods or crops if economics and policy support it. A reservoir release can be adjusted. A shortage tier can be declared. But water quality adds another layer because it is dynamic, local, biological, and often faster than policy. A bloom can form in a cove before a regional agreement is signed. A warning can affect visitors before a long-term basin plan is finalized. A toxin can challenge treatment assumptions before a new infrastructure project is funded. This is the systemic risk, speed mismatch. Climate signals accelerate. Ecosystems respond. Infrastructure age. Institutions negotiate. Budgets log. Public trust fluctuates. The river does not wait. The algae does not wait. Heat does not wait. This does not mean there is no solution. It means the solution cannot be single-purpose. The Southwest cannot solve the next water era with only bigger pipes, only conservation messaging, only emergency releases, only desalination dreams, only legal battles, only personal behavior, or only hope for snow. The system is too connected. Water quantity policy must talk to water quality monitoring. Urban planning must talk to agriculture. Energy planning must talk to hydrology. Recreation management must talk to public health. Climate science must talk to law. Tribal sovereignty must be central, not an afterthought. And the public must understand that adaptation is not a one-time project, it is an operating mode. Lake Mead makes this visible because it sits at the intersection of so many dependencies. The lake is a reservoir, a recreation area, a hydropower asset, a drinking water source region, an ecological system, a political symbol, and a climate indicator. When it falls, every identity is affected. When toxic algae appears, every identity gains a water quality dimension. That is why the phrase "new baseline" matters. A baseline is what people treat as normal. For decades, the normal assumption was that reservoirs could smooth out droughts, that low years could be buffered by stored water, that water managers could look backward to plan forward, that engineered systems could convert climate uncertainty into reliable delivery. The new baseline says, storage still matters, but storage is less secure. Engineering still matters, but engineering is not enough. Monitoring still matters, but monitoring must cover more variables. Public warnings still matter, but warnings must be believed and understood. Conservation still matters, but conservation must be structural, not occasional. The new baseline is not just less water. It is less forgiveness. That is the sentence. Less forgiveness in the atmosphere. Less forgiveness in reservoirs. Less forgiveness in infrastructure. Less forgiveness in politics. Less forgiveness in public health. And when a system has less forgiveness, small signs matter more. A green bloom near shore. A closed ramp. A weekly update showing 29%. A forecast showing weak inflow. A federal statement warning of risks to water and power infrastructure. These are not separate headlines. They are symptoms of a system being pushed beyond the conditions under which it became comfortable. The danger is not that the Southwest will wake up one morning and find Lake Mead gone. That image is too simple. The danger is that the system becomes gradually more expensive, more fragile, more contested, and more difficult to trust before the public fully understands the transition. This is how systemic risk usually arrives. Not as apocalypse, as friction. More restrictions, more warnings, more exceptions, more costs, more emergency meetings, more technical explanations, more places where the old answer no longer works. At Lake Mead, the toxic algae warning is one of those frictions. It is local, visible, and manageable, but it points to a future where managing water means managing a moving target. The Southwest has always been dry. That is not new. What is new is the combination: a vast engineered system, enormous human demand, a warming climate, reduced reservoir margin, and biological water quality risks emerging in places people still use and depend on. This combination is the story. Not drought alone, not algae alone, not climate alone, not infrastructure alone. The story is convergence. Lake Mead is where convergence becomes visible. Now we need to separate what is true from what only sounds true. Because in a crisis, exaggeration is easy. And exaggeration destroys trust. So here is what we can say with confidence. Lake Mead is very low relative to capacity. The Bureau of Reclamation's hydrologic update lists it at 29% full, with total Colorado River system contents at 34% of capacity. We can say that harmful algal blooms occur at Lake Mead National Recreation Area, and that the National Park Service warns visitors to avoid contact with visible algae, keep pets and children away, and avoid swimming or diving in areas with algae. We can say that cyanobacteria are common producers of freshwater harmful algal blooms, and that some cyanobacterial blooms produce toxins that can sicken people and animals. We can say that warm, slow-moving water favors harmful cyanobacterial blooms, and that climate change-related warming is expected to increase the magnitude and duration of cyanohabs in many freshwater systems. We can say that a past microcystin event in Toledo led to a do-not-drink advisory for a municipal water supply, proving that cyanotoxins can become a drinking water emergency under certain conditions. Those are the solid pieces. Now, here is what we should not say. We should not say that all of Lake Mead is toxic. The warning is about visible algae and affected areas, not a blanket claim that the entire reservoir is unsafe. We should not say that Las Vegas tap water is contaminated because of a harmful algal bloom warning at the lake. That would require specific water quality evidence from the treated supply, and this story does not provide that evidence. We should not say that one bloom proves climate change caused that specific event. Climate change can increase the risk conditions for harmful algal blooms, but attributing one particular bloom to climate change requires a separate scientific analysis. We should not say that Lake Mead is about to become another Toledo. Toledo is a precedent for the category of risk, not a direct forecast for Lake Mead. We should not say that drought automatically creates toxic algae everywhere. The mechanism depends on temperature, circulation, nutrients, light, species, and local conditions. This discipline matters, because the real story is strong enough without false certainty. The real story is that water systems are becoming more complex under stress. The real story is that quantity and quality are linked. The real story is that a shrinking reservoir can expose infrastructure, alter shorelines, create warmer shallow zones, complicate recreation, and demand more careful monitoring. The real story is that toxic algae warnings are not random noise when they appear in a basin already under pressure. Scientific credibility does not weaken the warning. It sharpens it. Fear says, everything is poisoned. Science says, certain conditions can produce harmful blooms. Some blooms can produce toxins. Avoid visible algae. Protect children and pets. Monitor carefully. Do not overstate what is known. Do not ignore what is plausible. Fear says, the lake is doomed. Science says, the lake is stressed, and stress changes risk. Fear says, there is nothing to do. Science says, reduce nutrient inputs where possible, conserve water, monitor blooms, improve communication, design infrastructure for lower and warmer conditions, protect public health, and manage the basin as if the old hydrologic baseline is no longer reliable. That difference matters for public action. People do not respond well to permanent panic. They either shut down or stop believing warnings, but people can respond to specific risk if the message is clear. Do not touch visible algae. Keep pets away. Do not drink untreated lake water. Report suspected blooms. Understand that low water is not only a scenic problem. Support water policy that reduces pressure before emergency. Expect water management to include quality, not just quantity. This is the balance the story needs. Urgency without exaggeration. Alarm without fantasy. Evidence without denial. Lake Mead does not need us to invent a catastrophe. It already shows enough. A reservoir at 29%. A river system near 1/3 storage. Official warnings about harmful algae. A warming climate that favors many bloom conditions. Infrastructure tied to water levels. Millions of people dependent on a stressed system. That is enough. The truth is heavy enough. Return to the shoreline. The white ring on the canyon wall is still there. It is quiet, but it is one of the loudest climate images in North America. It says the reservoir once stood higher. It says the system once had more stored water. It says the past is visible, even when people argue about the future. Below that ring, the water remains. That matters. Lake Mead is not gone. The Colorado River system is not dead. The Southwest is not helpless. Cities have conserved. Agencies have adapted. Engineers have built new intakes. Water managers have negotiated reductions. Scientists monitor risks. Public health warnings exist because institutions are still working. The story is not collapse. But it is also not comfort, because the water that remains is carrying too many burdens. It must be storage. It must be supply. It must be power. It must be recreation. It must be habitat. It must be treaty obligation. It must be political compromise. It must be public symbol. And now, in some visible places, it must also be watched as a biological risk. That is the central message of Lake Mead's toxic algae warning. The reservoir is not only warning us through absence, it is warning us through transformation. For years, the public has been taught to watch the level, watch the elevation, watch the shortage tier, watch the bathtub ring, watch the percent full. Those metrics remain essential, but the next era demands another question. What is happening to the water that remains? Is it warmer? Is it slower? Is it harder to manage? Is it more vulnerable to blooms? Is it putting more pressure on treatment, recreation, and trust? Is it still behaving like the water system we designed around? That last question may be the most important one. Modern society is built on hidden reliability. Most people do not wake up thinking about reservoir elevation, snowpack, cyanobacteria, hydraulic head, or interstate compacts. They wake up and turn on the tap. They switch on lights. They buy food. They drive through cities that should not exist at their scale without imported and stored water. They visit lakes for relief from heat. They assume the system is there. Lake Mead challenges that assumption, not by disappearing overnight, by becoming conditional. Water is available, but less abundant. Recreation continues, but some areas require caution. Hydropower remains, but lower elevation matters. Management continues, but the margin is thinner. Warnings are targeted, but the public must pay attention. The future will likely be full of these conditional statements. Safe, if monitored. Reliable, if conserved. Usable, if treated. Accessible, if redesigned. Affordable, if managed before crisis. Enough, if demand changes. That is not a message of doom. It is a message of adulthood. The 20th century water dream in the American West was a dream of control. Dams would hold the floods, reservoirs would bridge the droughts, canals would move water to growth, power would flow from concrete. The river would become schedule, contract, and delivery. The 21st century lesson is that control was always partial. The atmosphere still matters. Snowpack still matters. Heat still matters. Biology still matters. The shape of a cove still matters. The behavior of microscopic organisms still matters. A dog drinking from the wrong patch of water still matters. A family trusting a sign still matters. A city trusting its treatment plant still matters. The big system is made of small encounters. That is why the toxic algae warning feels so unsettling. It brings the crisis to the edge of the water, to the place where bodies meet policy. It says the Colorado River crisis is not only in courtrooms, forecasts, and federal reports. It is at the shoreline. It is in the green scum a child might notice before an adult does. It is in the decision to keep the dog leashed. It is in the sign that turns a lake from playground into warning. And yet the warning is also useful. Warnings are gifts if they arrive before failure. Lake Mead is giving a warning. It says water quantity and water quality must be managed together. It says infrastructure must be designed for lower, hotter, more variable conditions. It says public agencies need monitoring capacity before blooms become emergencies. It says cities must conserve not as a temporary sacrifice, but as a permanent operating principle. It says agriculture, urban growth, energy, tribal rights, ecosystem health, and recreation cannot be treated as separate water stories forever. It says the old baseline is gone. Not every year will be catastrophic. Not every summer will bring the same bloom. Not every forecast will be worst case. But the system is no longer living inside the assumptions that made it feel safe. A future with less water is difficult. A future with less predictable water is harder. A future with less water, warmer water, stressed infrastructure, and biological warnings is harder still. But difficulty is not destiny. The Southwest still has choices. It can reduce demand. It can protect source waters. It can modernize infrastructure. It can improve wastewater and nutrient management. It can expand monitoring. It can communicate risks clearly. It can honor tribal water rights. It can plan for heat, not just drought. It can stop pretending that a full reservoir is the only definition of success and start measuring resilience by how well systems perform under stress. The question is whether those choices happen early enough, because Lake Mead's message is not subtle anymore. It is written high on the rock. It is measured in federal tables. It is posted in public safety warnings. It is visible in green water where blue water used to feel unquestioned. The event will pass. A bloom can move, fade, die off, or be replaced by the next warning. Lake levels may rise and fall. A wet season may buy time. A policy agreement may reduce pressure. A new project may strengthen a weak point. But what Lake Mead is revealing will remain. The systems we built to forecast, store, deliver, and trust water are being tested by a world that no longer follows the old calendar. The reservoir is not just lower, it is less forgiving, and the most important question is no longer only whether Lake Mead will fill again. The question is whether we will keep building society as if water still behaves like it did in the last century.